This is Open Mind Alexander Technique. I'm Jess. Today we're talking about turning your head to look to your sides while sitting. The main activity that this is going to apply to for a lot of people, particularly a lot of Americans, is driving. How can we comfortably turn to look out our windows, look at mirrors while driving? So first we do that away from the actual setup, and I encourage you to also start working with this away from your car so that you can kind of examine what are the pieces of this and what are your innate habits about spiraling while you're sitting, away from the complexities of here's the actual situation. Pulling yourself away from the activity the first time you practice a movement can be really helpful for getting a clear kinesthetic sense of what is it that you're actually doing habitually as part of this movement. So first we need to talk about that word, spiraling. Why do I say spiraling? We don't in English have a great innate vocabulary for this. So in Alexander Technique lessons, we frequently will need to just specify, here's the word that I'm using and here's how I want it to be interpreted in this setting. So the easiest way to kind of figure this out is through the analogy of my arm. So if we imagine that this is my spine here, this is what I'm calling a spiral. So I'm rotating around the same axis. Now, if I put a bend in that, this is what I'm calling bending, a side-to-side bend. And that can be forward, backward, side to side, because a wrist, much like a spine, can go in various different directions. So here's what that can look like in me. Here's my spiral. The axis of my spine is what I'm spiraling around. A bend, well, I can do lots of different bends. A very common one that people will do in conjunction with a spiral without realizing it is some sort of torso bend that frequently is going to be a forward curl. So something like this. So if you imagine you're driving and you need to turn and look out your window, how many of you do this? This is a forward curl in conjunction with a spiral. Learning to break those apart and to be able to use them on purpose increases the chance that we'll be able to do these movements in ways that are helpful. So we kind of stylize this a little bit on purpose to start to be able to work with it. Let's start with eyes. So when I turn my just eyeballs to look to the sides, I have a certain amount of range where I can see pretty easily. Now on me, I've got glasses, so that does limit things just a little bit, but not by all that much. If my lenses were really small, then I would have a much smaller range of vision on the sides, but these are fairly wide lenses, so I have a good bit of side-to-side range that's still in focus. So if I just go a little farther than that, my head will start to turn. This isn't a big change in my head and my neck, but a little bit. The farther that I go to the side, take a look at my hands and my arms. They start to move. What would I have to do in order to keep my hands planted while spiraling? I have to engage muscles in my shoulders and my arms. So when I go this way, so you can see it pretty clearly, on this side, sorry, I hit my microphone there. When I go this way on this side, if I really keep my hands still, I'm having to pull in my shoulders to prevent the arm from being able to maintain neutral as it just wants to go with gravity. A released arm is a pendulum, it's just going to go with gravity. And so if I'm changing the orientation of my shoulders, then the arms are also going to want to move. Relating that to driving, though, is a little bit more difficult because I do have to keep my hands still. So this is where I'm going to use this idea of opposition and lengthening, allowing my arms to lengthen as I rotate will be able to keep my hands on my steering wheel. It is a little bit harder, so that I recommend when people first start, work away from the actual task that you have to do because that's, on hard mode, and come back to just simple rotations first. So moving my eyes and letting that travel down my spine. as I've been doing that, I've been keeping my weight fairly centered as far as what side of my pelvis I'm leaning towards. The bottoms of the pelvis are round. We call them your sit bones because that's what you sit on. But they're two little rocking chairs. And if I spiral, I can choose where to shift my weight in that process. I was working on this today with a cello player because they do a lot of these type of motions with working with their instruments and leaning and reaching to turn pages and stuff like that. And it was really interesting for him to explore what happened with his legs depending on where he shifted his weight while he was spiraling. So what I've been doing here is really an exercise in precision, and I like doing that because I think it's a fun challenge, but it's not a requirement. It's just something you can work towards if you want to. Keeping split weight on both of sides of my pelvis and my sit bones as I spiral. I find that that's the easiest way for me to still really leave my legs alone. But what might it look like if I shift my weight towards the side of my pelvis and where I'm resting on the chair towards the direction that I'm looking? It would look kind of like that. I'm exaggerating it just a little bit so that you can see it. A smaller version is just to here. So this is split weight. This is leaning forward a little bit onto the side that I'm spiraling towards. And notice that when I do that, the opposite leg is going to want to do stuff, especially. That's where it tends to kick in for a lot of people. You might kind of pull the leg up a little bit, or other people might actually push off and start to lean like that. Or I could also go away from the direction that I'm looking. So for example, if I'm turning to look this way, I would almost shift backwards. And it's interesting that when I watch people do this, and even in myself, I notice that there's a really automatic nonverbal communication response, where leaning towards is I'm interested in something, or I like something, or bring thing to me. Looking while leaning away is very excuse me, what did you say? There's that immediate response because that's when I would actually use that movement realistically to go back away from something that I'm looking at, to put distance. When you're driving, I would recommend you stay as kind of centered as you can. That's going to help with keeping your arms easily in contact with your steering wheel, and it's also going to help with leg fatigue and back fatigue while you're driving, especially if you're driving for long periods of time. So this spiral, I'm really allowing lengthening in both of my arms and asking my shoulders to stay as neutral as they can, which means that a lot of this change in distance is going to be achieved through my elbows. So the direction that I'm turning towards is going to need to lengthen because that shoulder is moving away from the steering wheel. So I need to increase that distance, which I can do at my elbows. So I encourage you to play around with this away from your car first, and then get in there and actually start playing around with it. See what happens to explore spiraling in your spine while in a seated position. Give it a try. See what happens.